A reading from Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus said to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, "Truly, I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done just as you have believed it would." And his servant was healed at that moment. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Rhonda. Good morning, church. My name is Carolyn Klassen, and I am a member of the teaching team here at TMP. My day job, though, is that I am a therapist. Part of my training as a therapist was to figure out how to hear horrific stories of great pain and be fully present and really be with that person in that moment authentically, and then figure out how to leave that pain behind, flush it through my system so that I could go home, be an effective wife and mother, and then show up the next day ready to be able to do it again. That's part of my training, and I think it's been pretty good. I've worked well at that. I've had enough experience, largely effective. However, there is a particular type of story that I am not good at shaking off. I lose sleep at night. It haunts me. And these are stories where people, mostly women, come into my office to describe the way a spiritual leader of some kind has had an inappropriate relationship with them while they were a parishioner, a student, or a junior staff person. These women, if they came forward to the leadership, were often criticized, ostracized, silenced. The pain of this feels horrific with me, and I have trouble figuring out what to do with that, because it feels like a special sort of evil when a representative of our God of love and redemption uses that power vested in them as a leader in the church to harm others. It's just wrong. In a similar awful vein, our country has a history of church organizations running residential schools for the people who were always here, and abusing power by forcing those children from their families and then mistreating them in the school with poor nutrition, abusive discipline, poor medical care, and sexual abuse. We have survivors and relatives of survivors in this room who continue to suffer the generational impact of the harms of residential schools. This morning, we speak about the abuse of power as the first in the teaching series that focuses on power. This, frankly, is an ugly and painful topic. It is disturbing for us all, but I want to acknowledge that it might be especially difficult for those of you who have experienced abuse of power. So I'd like to give you a trigger warning. For those of you who need to, please take care of yourself this morning. If you need to leave this room, or if you need to leave the screen, please do so, no offense taken. And I trust that the people around you will not be intrusive to ask inappropriate questions, but will rather offer you some care or a hug, which then you can decide if and how to receive. If your spirit needs to wander or leave while still sitting here, I understand that too. Please do it. A few years ago, a church leader who was mentor to many of the Mennonite Brethren pastors here in Manitoba was removed from his church in Ontario after allegations of inappropriate relationships with people in his church. Now, he had spoken here at the pastor's retreat here in Manitoba the year before, and he had really nourished and refreshed pastors' tired souls. They read the books that he authored, and they really valued him as a mentor. My pastor friends were devastated. How could he do this? And what did it mean about all they had learned about God and God's grace and mercy and power and loving kindness from him? What were they to do with all of that? Initially, it was discovered that a young woman in her early 20s had gone to this pastor for counseling, and he had exploited the relationship. There was a female pastor in the same church who was an ally to the victim, and she ended up choosing to resign from the church just as they were presenting the results of the investigation to the church. The report that the church leadership was presenting to the church said that what had happened was workplace harassment and an extramarital affair. The ally said this was actually an egregious abuse of power and it should be named as such. The response she received was that they couldn't name it that because there was literally no category for abuse of power in any of their policies. In the old days, we called these affairs. Now we know better. We have to understand it as an abuse of power. We are literally needing to create new categories to better understand the problems that are facing us. The #Church2 movement is calling on church to do better, to stop sweeping abuse under the rug and minimizing it. In the past, this was often done to protect God and God's church, as if God needs protection. Protecting the church from scandal does create unspeakable devastation in the lives of the direct victims, their families, the members of the congregation. And let me tell you, the ripple effects just go on. When a pastor who gives spiritual instruction about how to live, when they are in a place of authority to say, God told me you need to, or I need a little extra support to do this very important work of God, and so don't tell anyone or you'll wreck my ministry and destroy people's lives, but I need you to, ... These things are not an affair or simple workplace harassment. Historically, we blamed the parishioner for trying to ruin the pastor. She was asked to leave. She was blamed for what she must have worn or said or asked for. We didn't believe her, and we shushed her for raising the issue. The pastor got away with no consequences, a slap on the wrist, or maybe a brief timeout to reflect before restoration. I heard one time when the pastor confessed because he received the email the Friday night before, he got a standing ovation for his courage. We are only now developing language to call this an abuse of power. No matter how the relationship develops, the pastor was in a position of power and has the responsibility to make sure that boundaries are respected. Full stop. We are starting to recognize that turning a blind eye to abuse of power is not the way of Jesus. It was in this context that I started getting asked to deliver workshops to pastors, people in positions of power who were saying, if this can happen to a pastor this close to home, it could happen to any of us. How can we make sure that we don't abuse our power, that we don't sort of slide into an inappropriate relationship and then find ways to justify it in the moment, as really has happened since the history of time? Many of us, when we think about abuse of power in the context of the church, we think about the #Church2 movement. And this certainly is one of the most obvious ways to see it. But I also want to address the abuse of power much more broadly. While pastor abusing their power is the stuff you see in the headlines, I think it's too easy to think of abuse of power failings as happening over there, or maybe up here, and not in our own lives. Let's also recognize we all have the potential to abuse power. We all have power. Martin Luther King defined it like this: Power is the ability to achieve purpose and to affect change. Achieve purpose and to affect change. And according to this definition, there isn't a single one of us who doesn't have power as a parent, a teacher, a supervisor, an usher, a surly adolescent, a white person, a male, a person in upper class, a person in middle class, a person with charisma and charm, a Christian, a Canadian, a Sunday school teacher, a new Canadian who's been here a year longer than somebody else, someone who's been here for a month at TMP and shakes the hand of someone here for the first time. We all have power. Now, trust me, we can all come up with reasons why we don't have power while others do. I hear people speak and perceive themselves as quite powerless in my office all the time, even those who the rest of us would actually see as quite powerful outside of the counseling room. Some years ago, I had a conversation with a colleague when she stopped working at the counseling agency that I had started. She was going out on her own into private practice, and on her last day, she said to me, "Now we can be Facebook friends." And I said to her, "Aw, we've always been friends." And she said, "But you held my contract." Now, she was very confident and had more experience than I did in a number of areas. I looked up to her, and frankly, I was a little intimidated by her. I perceived her as more powerful than and I told her that. And she turned to me again and said, "But you held my contract." Apparently, that gave me power over her that mattered a lot to her, even if I, at that point in my life, wasn't feeling the power as a single mom scrambling to keep a roof over our heads, working 2 jobs. Others assign us power whether we like it or not. That conversation changed the way I saw myself. Inside, I might still feel like the little girl with glasses and ill-fitting clothes that isn't good at sports and that no one notices and so kind of is off to the side. But other people take my words more seriously than I do. This has taken me a while to learn. I have power, and now I get to decide how I'm going to use it. We have this whole series to acknowledge and celebrate the power we have. Come here in the coming weeks and use that power in life-giving, kingdom-building ways. Excuse me. When I look to decide how to use the power I have, I look to be like Jesus. Jesus had power. As the Messiah, the one who would save the world, if anyone had power, it was him. And a huge part of his time in ministry was spent with people wondering, how is this guy going to use all this authority? If he was king of the Jews, what would it look like? Some people were impatiently waiting for him to start the revolt, and other people spent a great deal of time trying to quash that power that just sort of seemed to emanate from him. So buckle up. I'm going to go through a bunch of examples of how Jesus used his power. First of all, in Matthew 8, Jesus healed a man with leprosy, a disease that made him the outcast, and restored both his health and brought him into community. Mark 5, a woman that had been suffering for 12 years touches Jesus' garment. He heals her, and he publicly affirms her faith in front of others who would have been very dismissive and disrespectful, disapproving. He restored her dignity. John 4, Jesus engages a Samaritan woman. That was a people group that was kind of from the other side of the tracks. And he reveals himself as the Messiah to her, which empowers her to go be a witness to her community. In John 8, Jesus defended a woman condemned to death by a mob, and he calls out their hypocrisy, and he offers her a grace and a path to a new life. And the passage that Rhonda read just before was in Mark 8, where Jesus heals a Roman centurion servant. So he crossed the cultural divide, and he broke those boundaries to honor the centurion's faith, and he then cared for somebody of low status. Do you see how this shows how Jesus uses his power to lift people up and to increase their power? What I notice is that he goes to the margins and uses his power to give a place to those who are powerless. Jesus also uses his power to challenge those that had a lot of power and weren't using it to make the world a better place. So don't unbuckle just yet. We're going to go through some more. In Mark 21, Jesus cleanses the temple where he drives out money changers who are exploiting worshipers. He condemns their greed and their misuse of sacred space. In Luke 10, in response to an expert in the law, Jesus elevates a Samaritan as an example of true neighborly love with that parable of the Good Samaritan, and he defies the cultural prejudices, kind of given the Pharisees kind of a mind confusion there, challenging them. In Luke 5, Jesus challenges the societal norms by eating with those labeled as sinners, and he defies the religious elite's expectations. He has dinner with Levi, the tax collector, and then he has a follow-up conversation with the Pharisees and teachers of the law who are upset and processes it with them. Mark 10, Jesus calls a wealthy man to give up his riches, exposing the grip of materialism and idolatry, saying that you're abusing your power and you have to let go, and he can't. And then in Mark 14, very powerfully, most significantly, Jesus remains silent and refuses to defend himself during the trial. He shows the cost of standing for truth. Jesus allows himself to be tortured and put to death. He chooses not to exert his power, but to lay down his life for us. Jesus uses his power to challenge those who are seeking to use their power to oppress. Jesus carried a lot of power, and he was without sin. Do you notice how all of these examples was not about using power over people, but going to places where people had less power, and he used that power to build them up and to bring them into the middle. Jesus was the ultimate ally of those who need support and care. And Jesus is the model of how to not abuse power. When I look to Jesus and I try to wrap words around his style so I can understand it better, I think the way justassociates.org define it is helpful. Most of us are uncomfortable with power because we know power almost always used as power over, where it's used to push people down and control people. A completely other way is to be utterly different about sharing power with, empowering people to, and inspiring people to develop power within. Jesus modeled this second way. He showed us a life of using power with, to, and within, and I think invites us to work with power in the same way. So let me contrast, because those are complex topics. Let me contrast for a minute the difference between these two styles, and I'm using the work of Dr. Brené Brown here. Power over believes that power is finite and uses fear to protect and to hoard power, while power with, to, and within believes that power becomes infinite and expands when it's shared with others. There's not that culture of scarcity. Power over leverages fear to divide, destabilize, and devalue decency, while power with, to, and within leverages connection and empathy to unite and stabilize, and it values decency as a function of self-respect and respect for others. Power over has people maintain power by cruelty if necessary. Power with, to, and within frames leadership as a responsibility to be in service to others rather than be served by others. Power over believes that being right is the most important, while power with, to, and within believes making it right is the most important. Abuse of power, using power over, is a thing. It's a real thing. And I suspect that I could have a conversation with any of you in this room or online where you could tell me a story of how a parent or a manager or a teacher or a pastor or a mentor said or did things that shamed you, embarrassed you, was aggressive, coercive, manipulative to exploit your goodwill, took your money, forced you to do things against your will, hurt you in ways that didn't just hurt in the moment, but had lasting impact that remains even alive today, where the past still remains present. You're a little skittish around your next supervisor, you don't trust someone in authority, or your relationship to Jesus is on shaky ground because the one who hurt you was one of his representatives. There is real and long-term damage to the abuse of power. Here's the thing. I suspect that it would not be as easy or quick finding people in this room this morning or online who would be able to tell me just as easily how they themselves had abused power over others, where they have shamed, embarrassed, were aggressive, coercive, manipulative, or exploited somebody else's goodwill, or hurt somebody else in a way that had lasting and long-term implications. How is it that we as humans are so quick to feel the power that has been abused when we are the victims, but we don't see it when we are the perpetrators, the ones who are not using our power in the way of Jesus? There are psychopaths and sociopaths that abuse others consciously and maliciously, and they don't self-select to come to therapy, so I haven't met them. But they are actually a very small proportion of the population, and they alone do not explain the vast numbers of people who have experienced abuse of power, who have experienced abuse of power in all the run-of-the-mill and more serious ways that we could list easily in this room. And yet, no one self-identifies as an abuser of power. No one identifies as a power abuser. The only way to explain it is that most people who abuse power don't even realize that they do. I have been surprised, as I have spent more than 2 decades in counseling practice, that I have had people who have come to see me that have abused power, but not a single one of them coming into therapy would have recognized it as such. The people I see that have abused power generally feel quite powerless. They feel shame, like they're not enough. They feel small and helpless, cornered. And abusing their power is a really desperate way to cut another person down to size so that somebody's as little as they are. Or sometimes they are so desperate to connect with someone who they see is as vulnerable as they are. Remember The Incredibles, the family of superheroes? Jack is the baby, and not just an ordinary baby, but one with superpowers. When he's mad, his powers kick in. He becomes a ball of fire, or he develops laser eyes that can cut and burn. But he's a baby. He's got power, but he doesn't have what it takes to know how to use it well. Us too, when we don't know our own power, we become dangerous. So let me suggest a few guidelines about abuse of power for us all to ponder upon. Talk about these at lunch, push back on these ideas, ponder them all in your heart as we all seek to live like Jesus. We have to work with and try to chew and digest this stuff. First, like I said, we all have power. Power isn't right or wrong, it just is. These power lines, they give power to homes, which is great. If one of them disrupts and falls on you, it can burn your house or electrocute you. Power can be used for good or evil. We can't remove our own power. It just doesn't work like that. 2, when we aren't aware of our power, we are more likely to abuse it. The more you are ignorant of your power, the more likely you are to be like Jack, where your denial or ignorance of it means you become dangerous. You speak up in a meeting unawares that your volume has others shrink back, or not recognizing that the color of your skin, or your gender, or your age, or your presumed bank balance means that your words have more authority than what you might imagine. Number 3, when we have abused power, part of the ongoing abuse is to insist we have not abused it. I recently watched a friend be accused of abuse of power. She was in a position of power, and the accusation gutted her. She wept and prayed and prayed and wept and examined her actions. She consulted with other people, looked over those texts and emails to see if there was truth. This, I have to tell you, was so healing for me. As so often when I see people accused of misuse of power, they do what we call DARVO, an acronym for defend, attack, and reverse victim and offender. So, for example, the pastor who's had a relationship with a parishioner confesses publicly and commits to healing and is quickly restored, and the woman is questioned and criticized and judged about why she's making such a fuss when this could impact the church. Dr. Laura Anderson says, sometimes it's not about the thing that happened to us, it's about the thing that happened after the thing that happened to us. The response to victims is often more traumatizing than the abuse that happened in the first place. Not cool, people, not cool. We have the responsibility to figure out how to deal with that better. If someone says you intimidated or bullied them, work to stay soft and curious, asking questions and finding out more about where that came from. Number 4, the systems we live in are often set up to unwittingly seek to support those in power and to disempower those that don't have it. Systems don't like change. Systems are slow to change. Systems were built by people in power to maintain power. They support the people who have power over. These last weeks, I have spent many very angry hours seeing some of my friends from Africa have very different experiences at the border passing through immigrations and customs that I do. My border hassles do not begin to compare to the very real hassles and extremely negative experiences some good friends of mine have had. It is too blatant to be coincidence. The color of our skin is very different, and it matters. Number 5, the call of God is to recognize the power we have and seek to be humble about it, to use it the way Jesus did. When we own our power, we can share power with, we can empower people to, and we can inspire people to develop power within. We can go to where Jesus is, at the margins, and find ways of leveraging what we've got to have other people feel empowered. Our colleagues, students, children, the people we usher. This is the call of God in our lives. Number 6, the call of God is to recognize the tendency for the world to use power over, and we need to spot it and to stand with those so that they don't have to stand alone. And I gotta tell you, this takes courage. Jesus challenged the system when he saw an abuse of power. He didn't expect the people who were victims to speak truth to power by themselves. He advocated, emboldened, modeled respect and dignity. Other people saw that and they changed their behavior. And I have to tell you, it pissed a lot of people off when he did it, and it was an important part of his ministry, and he paid dearly for it. I think it needs to be in our lives if we are going to follow in his steps. And number 7, the comfort of Jesus is to be in the space knowing that when we are on the suffering side, when we have been victimized by the abuse of power, Jesus is there and he is in the suffering with us. If there is anyone who understands what it is like to be stripped of all power, be treated inhumanely and well beneath his dignity in a way that is personally painful, it is Jesus. Jesus gets it. We just finished Christmas, where we celebrated how the Almighty God of the universe had diaper rash, just like the rest of us. And then after all those years of good and healing work, he was shamed and humiliated with a terrible form of execution. We are not alone when we experience an abuse of power. Jesus sees it, understands, walks with us. In late fall, Pastor Bob announced at a teaching team meeting that we were having a series on power. And it rose out of a prayer from Gloria, who felt God was speaking to her about this, and she came to Bob about it. When he announced a series on power at the teaching team meeting, I, a layperson who have never been on staff at the church, but I have an ear for this sort of topic, asked if he was going to do anything on abuse of power in the series. It hadn't occurred to him, and he wrote it down. Now, Bob is the lead pastor here. He's a really busy guy. He supervises a lot of people, has a lot of ministries. He's got a lot of responsibility. He speaks to a lot of people. He's busy. Life went on, and I forgot about that meeting. A few weeks later, he sent me a message asking if I would speak on abuse of power in this series. He adjusted it. In a world where the church is more known for abuse of power than empowerment of others in a Christ-like way, it felt like Pastor Bob preached out today's teach to me before I had even thought about it. He used his power to say this topic was important, that my idea was valuable, and that those who have felt pushed away and scarred by abuse of power they can and would be seen this morning. He used his influence, his power to encourage me to be up here this morning sharing it with you. That matters a lot. That's our church. Danielle Strickland has some final thoughts on the use of power. I invite you to listen.
It doesn't matter what version of church you're in, this is an exposing season for the church and how it's misused its power. I've been involved in some pretty sad, terrible ramifications of pastors and leaders who use their power to actually abuse. I had this revelation of God when he appeared to Moses in the burning bush that really rocked my world, where, this is such a familiar passage of scripture about when God shows up in this burning bush, what attracts Moses to the bush is not the fire. That's actually not even that big of a deal in a desert. Bushes combust, like that happens, it gets that hot. What's a big deal and why Moses went to the bush was he's like, how is this bush on fire but not being consumed? I better go see what that is. And he literally, in the scripture, he says this, what's that? What is that? And when he gets there, God speaks to him and says, this is holy. And holy, actually, we made it into a very religious word, but literally the definition of holy is, we don't have any words for this. This is so beyond anything that we even have ever seen before or know what it is that we just call it other than or sacred. We know it's God, but we just don't even know what it is, so we call it holy. What is this? And God's power is greater than, which we talk about a lot. People talk about this a lot. We sing songs about it. He's higher than, he's greater than, he's bigger than. I really wish whoever wrote those songs would also add this one line, he's different from. Because God's power is as different from as it is greater than. So if all we're doing is saying God's power is greater and we're taking that power and using it to display our greatness because of God's power, it's not God's power. That's power like everybody else uses power. If we take that power like God suggested to Moses and use it for the cry of the oppressed, if that power flows down, then it's evidence that it's God, because it's not just a greater power, it's a different power. And that is where everybody goes. What's happening? What is this? And I determined I wanted to live a what is this life. I don't just want to live a God is greater than life. I want to live a God is greater than and different from any other power that ever exists. It's for people without it. And if you're not using the power of God for people who don't have the power of God, you're not using the power of God. That's a different kind of power.
Carolyn, so much appreciation for you. Thank you so much for serving this morning. So one person says, thank you, Carolyn, for the insightful and clear way you spoke about power this morning. What are some ways we can empower those who have less power?
I think, first of all, it's for us to recognize that we do have that power that we can give to other people. Sometimes when I'm even just in here, I'm like, oh, I don't know that person. What if I went over and shook their hand? Would that be okay? Like, would they think I was being too presumptuous? And I think it's first of all, just recognizing we have power to say, I can go over and shake that person's hand, and it's not weird, and I'm not presuming something, and I can make their lives better. And so when we own our own power, then we can go over and help somebody, and often it's with asking them, is there something I can do to support you, or asking permission so that we don't decide what they need, because I think that's then abuse of power, where we find out from them how we can resource them. But I think it's everywhere. We can find anywhere and everywhere. Let somebody in ahead of us a line reach something above at the grocery store that's too tall for them and that you can reach. There's all sorts of ways that we can use our power to help people.
Okay. I think my fingers are too big. I'm struggling with tapping on this iPhone. And then another question is, this is a long one. So how do we balance or conceptualize the God of the Old Testament, which can sometimes seem like more of a power over dynamic with the Israelites and the sinful nations? And then the person goes on to say, God is always a loving God, but the Old Testament seems to convey a more intense expression of power than what we see of Jesus. How do we hold both these and understand our way of being in the world? Sorry, that's a long one.
That's a long one, yes. And I am no Old Testament scholar,
Yep.
but I've just been reflecting often how the Israelites kept saying, we want a king, we want a king. And God would say, you don't need a king, like, just follow me. And he said, no, we want a king. That there was ways in which they were looking to consolidate power and have somebody that they could look to. And God says, look to me. And then there was all these ways he was looking to be generous to God and to God's people. And I think we have to recognize that. And I'm sure that ask somebody who's an Old Testament scholar and they can give you a whole lot better answer than I can just right now.
Thanks.
I'm sorry. Okay.
That's good. That's good. Another long, intense one a little bit. The historical abuse of power in Jesus' name in Canada is a significant part of our country's narrative, and as a result, I am often ashamed to be identified as a Christian. How do I, as a Jesus follower, work to restore the true gospel and work to heal this abuse of power?
I think we are all struggling with how, when the body of Christendom is so broad and we see people espousing power in ways that we're not comfortable with, it's hard to say I'm a Christian when some people identify as a Christian. And so sometimes I call myself a Jesus follower because the way I've talked about Jesus this morning and how he used his power, it feels like people might be able to get that a bit more.
Sure.
And I think we have to recognize that the church is always going to be messed up. We're always seeking to become more and more into the likeness of Christ. And so part of my spiritual journey right now is to figure out how to be inclusive and welcoming and not hateful towards people who use power as a Christian differently than I do. It's my job to love them as well, and that's not easy, while we're still recognizing the abuses and harms that have been done in the name of Christ in this country, which is so not okay.
Wow. Well put. Well put. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Thanks.
Please send us off.
Okay. I'd like to send you off with a blessing, and I'm borrowing the words of Father Gregory Boyle here. My blessing is this: may we inch ourselves closer to creating a community of kinship, such that God might recognize it. Soon we imagine with God this circle of compassion, that we imagine no one standing outside of that circle, moving ourselves closer to the margins so the margins themselves will be erased. We stand with those whose dignity has been denied. We locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. At the edges, we join the easily despised and the readily left out. We stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so the day will come when we stop throwing people away. Kinship with others is what God presses us onto. And so I would ask you to be about that this week. And for those of you who might feel as one who is poor, powerless, voiceless, demonized, or disposable, if that describes you, know that we are so glad that you were here with us this morning. Please come next week because we are not complete without you. You belong. There are people up front who want to pray with you and for you. Go in the power and with the power of Jesus. Amen.